Okay. So, with that in mind, then we'll go ahead and kick off for tonight's presentation of Play All the Games with me, your host, John Singer. Let's go ahead and start out with the most fun part of any emulation system, which is just making it very clear that we are not supporting piracy here. Not any manifestation of piracy, not any level. So, you're on your own with this stuff. ROMs are illegal for you to download, and they're illegal for you to transfer or sell or any other fun stuff. So let's just make it very clear that you will be assuming all risk going forward. This presentation is for educational purposes only. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. So, now it's out of the way. So the agenda for tonight's meeting is I'll do a little bit of who am I, so I'll introduce myself. We'll talk about what is emulation, and also we'll talk about the history of emulation. I'm really big on building a foundation when I give my tech talks. We'll get into the legalities of it. You probably just experienced some of it where I just told you I'm not responsible for what you do with this. Emulation in the real world, you'd be surprised. It is not just for playing games like what we're talking about tonight. There's actually a lot of applications for game emulation specifically. Then we'll actually get to the fun part of building your own emulation Pi system. And we'll talk a little bit about sourcing the emulators and the games and what that looks like. And getting that set up. And finally, some tips and tricks to kind of help you along the way. Little things that I've learned that make it a lot easier and more fun to play on, right? So, who am I? My name is Jonathan Singer. I have a Master's of the Cybers from USF here in Tampa and a Bachelor's of IT from UCF. I'm a DEF CON security goon several years now. Love it. You see me in a red shirt, probably yelling at you, but I mean it with all the love in my heart. Over here in Tampa, OWASP, I'm a co-leader with a wonderful crew, and also co-founded B-Sides Orlando. As mentioned earlier by Mr. John over here, I'm the Splunk dude over at GuidePoint Security down here in the Southeast, so Splunk stuff too. I'll talk to you about that. Got lots of certs and things. I don't know, I don't get into it. Lots of letters after my name. And one of the fun parts is I'm a guildmaster over here at Undercroft. So you can find me on Slack for all of our guild members. Reach out, say hello, and if you need help with anything or want to learn something cool, let me know. So that's a little bit about me. Let's jump right into the fun of it, right? So this one is focusing on the basics of emulation, right? Before we really start to talk technical about anything, we actually need to understand what's going on. And this is not just fancy software that does things and stuff. There's actually a lot more complexity taking place, and having a good understanding of this foundation is going to help us when we get to building our own Raspberry Pi emulator. Fun fact, does anybody have any of these systems that I have here? From like the original Pong Atari, there's the 2600 that's very famous, right? Everybody wishes that their parents didn't sell it in that garage sale years ago. And then even some of the more modern Atari systems like the 5200 and the 7800. So, as I promised, let's set a foundation, right? What is an emulator? So it's hardware or software that enables one computer, right? So a host, to behave like another computer system. And remember that, a Nintendo is in a sense a computer, an arcade machine is in a sense a computer, right? It's maybe an unconventional computer, but it's still a computer as much as your Nest thermostat is a computer. It still has a processor. It still runs code. And so this typically enables the host to run software and use these periphery, right, of the guest system. So one system is now operating within the confines of another system, almost like virtualization in a sense, right? And what's interesting here is that video game console emulators specifically, because there's lots of different types of emulators out there. The concept of emulating systems has been around for a long time. It doesn't just fall to games. It just happens tonight that we're talking about games. Now, video game console emulators, these particular programs, they allow a computer, like a personal computer, or my favorite part, another video game console to emulate a video game console. And I highlight that because this isn't just limited to what you can do on a Raspberry Pi computer or a laptop or any other conventional PC. You can make systems play other systems, and we'll get into that. So how does this work? Well, the emulator being the software and hardware abstraction, right? Well, the next part of this is, well, what about the games? And so the way this works is the code and data of a game, right? They're typically given to the emulator. So the emulator is the software that runs the game data, right? And this game data is often known as a ROM, right? And why do we call this a ROM? Well, read-only memory, right? It's the game is burned onto these ROM chips with the intention of not being manipulated. It's read-only. So we can use a ROM file, right? It's the copied data from a cartridge, because inside these plastic cartridges is nothing more than memory chips. Or technically, we can also call ROMs, it's grown in language, but maybe the ISO, or the copy of a CD, because games no longer come on memory cartridges. They come on maybe optical media, or even SD cards or smart card variants, right? Like you'll see in Nintendo Switches, for instance, look like an SD card. So, but for the sake of calling it, ROMs is going to just refer to the data of a game at this point, right? And so it's grown. And so how do we do this? How do we get the data off of these microchips, right? Well, not everybody has access to very specific tools to dump this memory and read all the pins and extract it off the board. So you can use specialized tools like this picture here, which is a cartridge dumping system. And it lists out all of the different types of game consoles that are supported. So we have stuff like Famicom, which was the Nintendo in Japan, the family console. Stuff like Sega Genesis, Nintendo 64, the original NES, and Super NES, right? And even Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. So this particular device was built to read a lot of different types of ROMs off of retail and original authentic cartridges. And then it outputs it over a USB port to software to then save that data into a file, right, that is read by our emulation software. Now, the other way is, let's talk about those ISOs. Some game systems have developed hardware security so that you can't just make a copy of a game. For instance, you can't just go copy a PlayStation game and expect it to work, necessarily. And even some systems add hardware defects into the disk. And that's a whole nother direction on game copyright and DRM and how they prevented fraudulent Xbox and PlayStation games throughout history. That's a very interesting adventure, but that's not what we're going to get into tonight. But what people learned is they figured out methods of reading the game data off of some of these secured disks using modified CD drives and maybe rewriting the firmware to read a section that wasn't normally accessible, or to maybe spin it backwards, right? If the data was written in a reverse format, right? And so there's very interesting ways that people have figured out how to collect the game data from various mediums over the years. And something interesting too is that being that these are somewhat unconventional computers still, they often have a BIOS, right? And this basic input-output system may also be required. And those are a little bit more difficult to get a hold of from a dumping perspective. You don't have the kind of tools and hardware readily available. So these I offer you the interesting adventure of figuring it out on your own. So now that we've collected the information we need, why do we run emulators? Like, what do we care, right? What's the importance of all this? I get we all want to have fun, but there's a bigger picture going on here. For instance, I love playing some of these older games, right? And I still have a regular Nintendo that you have to push on the spring to get the game to work. I still have a Super Nintendo, from the early 90s. I definitely still have these systems, and they're a lot of fun. But it's very complex to hook up to a modern television these days. They're not HDMI. Oftentimes, some of the games may no longer work. The things have degraded over the years, and it just kind of gets a little bit difficult. So this gives you the opportunity to play some of those games that you actually do own, but are just dealing with a little bit of a technical limitation to return to that bit of nostalgia, right? And why not, right? I want to play them. I bought them. I own them. I should be allowed to play it, and technology shouldn't be getting in the way of it. But the other one, too, is that you can play one console now on another system. So if I have an Xbox, why can't I play my Super Nintendo game that I own on my Xbox? Especially if that game was never released for Xbox. You didn't lose a sale, right? And there's a lot of politics into it. We'll get into that later. But the idea is now we have this cross-compatibility of remember that game consoles aren't just game consoles, they are computers. And so it opens up a wide variety of portability. You can play Game Boy games on your cell phone. You can play Nintendo on your Xbox, okay? The other big one I really like, and this actually is something that I looked into, is translated games that never were released in your country. I put up a picture here of Mother 3, and it's actually better known in America as Earthbound, a very popular classic Super Nintendo game. And the third variation of this game was never released in America. It was only in Japan. And so independent people online decided to look at the game, and they built an entire translation. They replaced all the text in the entire game with the proper English translation and released it online so that American players could play through this highly sought after Japanese game that they just, one, if you wanted to play it, it was probably in PAL, not NTSC, so it wouldn't even work on your modern Nintendo system, even if you wanted to. And two, you couldn't read Japanese, so you didn't fully understand the story. And so it's really interesting of these great opportunities that come from emulation. Furthermore, you can modify existing games. Really popular right now is in Super Mario, like these speed runs on YouTube where people build their own impossible or super hard levels. And so that's very interesting, and it came from the concept of modifying some of these games. You can also look at the textures, the maps, and the music in these games and build creative media off of this, right? And so taking the music from a game and you can incorporate that into some kind of audio and track, and there's just a lot of fun things you can actually do with the information once you can get it out of these systems. You can also create new games for older systems. There's actually an entire community of individuals these days that build modern games for classic systems. And I mean, you can still get what we would consider new, like Sega Genesis games that aren't necessarily released by Sega and all these other things. This is what we call the homebrew community. And they're developing games for these consoles and for these systems just because they love to and they want to share this stuff with other people. And there's other things beyond this of the benefits, but there's great historical factors, there's great experiential factors, and there's great learning factors that people are mostly using it for, right? This exactly is to relive that nostalgia. And especially if these games are not for sale anymore, you can't buy the cartridges anymore. You've looked all over eBay, you still can't get a hold of it. There's just a lot of really great opportunity to bring back and relive some of that history from decades ago. So let's talk about that history of emulation and what it looks like a little bit. So I'm going to jump into this first one here. Early emulation, and there was emulation before this, but I'm specifically starting at this point in time because, one, the name was Nesticle, but something was different about this piece of software. What was different about Nesticle, at the time there were several other Nintendo Entertainment Systems, so NES emulators, but people were actually selling this software. This was shareware at the time in the early 90s. And so this particular one I wanted to highlight because it was the first freeware with the sole purpose of playing NES games on a PC. I mean, we're talking MS-DOS here. And you, however you acquired your ROM, this piece of software was fantastic. It supported so many games. It was very fast. It was very powerful. And it was actually revolutionary in a lot of the features that it offered. In fact, it was very popular through most of the late 90s. One of the features that it pioneered that we consider modern today is the ability to record your gameplay. Like, think, an MS-DOS program, some freeware to play, an emulator to play NES games, had really great features that some of these commercial shareware prior didn't even support. In fact, they barely played NES games. It was more or less, some people's really solid attempts at getting this stuff to work. But this was one of the really early on big hitters on the scene, and it made a lot of influence in modern emulators we see today. So now that we're in about the mid to late 90s, emulation it exploded at this point. I mean, we are now working in Windows 95, and so we have complex GUIs, we have very powerful systems. And so emulation is becoming more and more possible. Now, it may sound crazy, but it's kind of hard to emulate a video game console. You may think like, oh, well, a Game Boy is only 4.91 megahertz. That's not that much. But there's a lot more complexity in it. You have to remember that a game console is focused and hardware built to achieve one goal, which is play that game. Your computer is built to be versatile and play maybe that game, but also like a bunch of other things. Run Microsoft Word in its early ages and all the Internet Explorer. But the point is this: you're competing against focused built hardware, and that was some of the challenge. And so technology in the PC realm needed to catch up a little bit to even be able to carve out a portion of what its resources were to achieve that visual goal. And so about this time, the Super Nintendo is coming onto the market, the PlayStation is coming onto the market. The late 90s were huge when it came to video game console systems and home console systems for play. Prior to this, there was only, really the handful of the Atari, the original NES, Commodore and Amiga were still big, but that was still also kind of a computer space. And so these other emulators began to follow, and we started to see Sega Genesis emulators. We started to see Super Nintendo emulators, Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and PlayStation emulators. SNES 9X was released around this time, and what's interesting is that piece of software is still used to this day as one of the most popular Super Nintendo emulators available online. And this also goes for some of the early advancement in PlayStation emulation, right? And up to now, everything has been game cartridge based. So ROM memory, as it really is, using that data from the chip and playing it in this emulator to emulate this graphic based hardware, this game hardware. But PSEMU was different. This was interesting. It actually was focused on running commercial games. There was a little bit of complexity around how do you play a PlayStation 1 disc on a computer. Most people would find if you pulled it up on your CD drive, either nothing would come up, or it definitely wasn't a game. So there was some teams in the early PlayStation development phases that wrote their own PlayStation disk drivers for your CD-ROM drive to be able to read these games. And we're now getting to the point where you can play an entire normal PlayStation game in the CD drive of your computer and use either the keyboard and mouse or use some kind of adapter to convert controllers. And so, this was all before the turn of the millennium, which was just a couple years of amazing advancement in the emulation scene. So I have to pay tribute to MAME, being the most popular, one of the most consistent emulators in the scene. MAME stands for Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator. And what would be an emulator talk if we didn't talk about this? So it is free, it is open source. It didn't start out this way. It went open source after a couple years. I believe it started in 2003. And but the whole intention of this particular emulator was it wasn't to necessarily do like a PlayStation or a Nintendo. MAME kind of preserves the gaming history of arcade machines. And arcade machines are a little bit different than a gaming console in the sense that, yes, it's more purpose-built gaming hardware, but it's a lot more complicated. If anybody's ever looked inside an older arcade cabinet, I think the board is about, you know, the size of a pizza box. Right? There's a lot of things going on. And so arcade games have been around for a long time. You know, think Pac-Man and original stuff like that. And so MAME has grown and kept up with the scene for a long time. It's still open source, it's still free, and currently supports over 7,000 unique games can be played through MAME, this particular emulator software. And what's fun I have pictured here is what we call a MAME cabinet, or an arcade cabinet, where you take a retail machine or you build a new one. These are readily available, and you install a computer in that base. And this you know, support of keypads and buttons is joysticks and all kinds of things. Think the golfing game with the spinny ball, right? And so you can build or purchase custom hardware to connect to the computer inside this MAME cabinet to use what feels like a legacy arcade experience. In fact, you can even hook up the coin solenoids and get that functioning. It's really cool what's capable with the software today. So you can achieve a full arcade emulation experience using a modern computer. Thanks to the MAME software. It's this really cool custom front end. So what you see on the screen is a full menu system of all the games installed and available to play. You use your standard controls to navigate, and you can get this running easily on Windows and Linux and things like that. It's very powerful. In fact, MAME has been ported to almost every possible system out there. So you can get MAME on your iPhone and on your Android and other handhelds like that too, to support playing of old and classic arcade games. So shout outs to MAME, super cool stuff. So I have a couple of very important shout outs in the history of emulation, because these certain landmarks and these certain systems provided a really revolutionary approach that changed the next generation. And so the first one is called Ultra HLE. And so this was the first successful Nintendo 64 emulator, and it didn't do things in the old emulation definition, right? And we talked about how emulation is to achieve the hardware and software of another system. Well, what this is it pioneered HLE, high-level emulation. This is a little bit different. And so instead of trying to emulate all the components of a game console, right, these custom CPUs and these custom memory chips and these custom architectures, they basically tried to just look at what the game was saying as far as the data coming in and out of the game and work with it and guess what it was trying to do. And so the concept of HLE is tailored around specific games themselves. Let's take Mario 64, for example. There were certain commands coming out of the Mario 64 cartridge or the ROM, and the HLE approach would be to tailor responses to all of those commands coming out of this particular game. Now, let's switch over to Mario Kart 64. Suddenly the commands are a little bit different. It wasn't speaking all the same things, or maybe it had new commands. And so the HLE approach would be then to add additional support for that game. And what happened here is because they weren't emulating the very basic rudimentary level of these systems, they were actually just targeting on what the game needs and giving it what it needs. This was super fast. I mean, to this day, emulating Nintendo 64 is still very difficult. Even, I'm talking now. But think in 1999, basic hardware, we were probably using Pentium processors, you know, very basic stuff. And so the developers behind Ultra HLE targeted about, I think about 20 games that they built these responses for, and they were able to get these games to play not only successfully, because other emulators, the first goal was to get the game to initialize and turn on. Frame rate, sound, and choppiness was the phase 2. These games were playing at full playback speed with full features, no issues at all. And nobody had seen anything like this before. This level of speed when it comes to an emulator. It was just crazy. And so this HLE concept, this high-level emulation, was born from this piece of software. Now, with every good thing, things get a little weird. It is very sad, but the piece of software, Ultra HLE, sadly was discontinued within hours of its public release. Yeah. And the reason behind this is because the authors felt inundated with requests and traffic. They didn't want to be famous. They had no interest in this. They really enjoyed this project. And incessant user demand actually caused the demise of Ultra HLE. And at that point, like, it was released, 6 hours later, it was silent. I mean, that was the end of it. And it's really sad because this really changed a lot of things in the emulation scene. It took a couple of years later for the source code to finally be released and other people to take over the project. But that's a tough feeling to have people demanding things of you. Oh, you didn't put my favorite game. I need you to make my favorite game work on your emulator now, right? And they had enough of it. And so be nice to the open source and emulator community out there. So the next big interesting shout out I wanted to point out here was the commercialization of emulation. I mean, yes, I mentioned a little bit earlier about shareware going around the good old BBSs and the IRCs of the day with the NES emulators in the early 90s and mid 90s. But this one's different. Connectix took this to a whole nother level. This company commercialized the idea of PC emulators and emulating the PlayStation more specifically. And so in 1999, they released the Virtual Game Station. And it was featured, I think the conference was called Macworld or Mac Expo, whatever the big Mac conference at the time was. And Steve Jobs even saw this PlayStation game running on a Macintosh. And it was very interesting, this software. It could run on the standard G3 that was available at the time with a 233 megahertz processor and an ATI graphics card, right? Everybody remember ATI? So, but it was cool. This took that commercial gameplay to a whole other level. You can put the CD into the G3's drive and play the game on your Macintosh, right? And so this was very new and revolutionary at the time. And this company tried to take it seriously. They really wanted to do this, I guess we'll call it the right way. So they designed it like a console. Like, this software had safety checks. It was region locked, just like a game system. And by the way, I didn't bring up region lock, but the idea is that a game console is region locked like a DVD to what part of the world it operates in. And I'm not just talking NTSC versus PAL, so your TV works. I'm talking European games play on European systems, and Japanese games play on Japanese systems, and American games play on American systems. And so Connectix region locked to only play games for the region that the software was being used in. And copied games didn't even work, right? They didn't bypass the security of the discs to allow a burned or pirated copy. Only the original games would work. And finally, they didn't allow the multi 50, 60 hertz thing either. You either had an NTSC or a PAL version, right? And so they saw what the consoles were doing, and they said, okay, well, if we're trying to be legit, we want to do this too. Like, again, all good things turn another way. So originally, Sony filed a lawsuit very quickly against Connectix and actually failed, but they were successful in getting a temporary injunction at the time, and that put Connectix in a position where they were no longer to sell their software or anything of that nature, and basically went financially broke at that point, having come out of a very litigious court case, plus all revenue streams are now cut off. And so Sony took advantage of the situation and actually purchased Connectix, their software, the Virtual Game Station, and immediately discontinued it. So I know, right? It's tough, right? Because it's a PlayStation not sold, but at the same time, like, it's just software, bro. It's not like they pirated or stole anything. Anyways. All right, here's another big call out. And this happened around the exact same time, right? These are the two big ones on the market was the Virtual Console, but also this Bleem, right? And there's a lot of speculation of what Bleem stands for. Only the original creators know, and they actually haven't told anybody. But like the previous, this was commercial, and this was available for retail. It had DRM and copy protection, and you couldn't pirate it, all this fun stuff. I mean, you could crack it, but the point is that they took the commercialization of the software seriously, okay? And what was different about this company is they didn't just make PlayStation emulators for your computer. They made a PlayStation emulator for the Dreamcast. Now imagine having a Dreamcast that could play not just Dreamcast games, but also PlayStation games. Now, if anybody remembers, something was different about the Dreamcast. It ran Windows CE more specifically, but it was considered, I would say, the most like a modern computer at the time out of all the game consoles available. And you could, compile standard Windows binaries and run them on Dreamcast. Very interesting. So Bleem comes to the market, and they have Bleem for the PC and Bleemcast for the Dreamcast. Things just happen to the same way, right? Sony pursued legal action, and it equally was financially unable to defend itself, and was forced to go out of business. During its development, there was a lot of hope for the Bleemcast side of the house, but they never really did get to beyond about 3 games. They were called Bleem Packs, and it was more or less a way of loading the PlayStation emulator to be played on the Dreamcast. But this company also came in and went fairly quickly, but it's very cool to see now the adoption and the commercialization of emulation taking place in the market, and people starting to realize that this isn't just like a fun project anymore. There's a lot of opportunity here, and so we're starting to get to the turn of the millennium, right? All right, so the next one, big shout outs to, I want to mention, is called Dolphin. And so the Dolphin project is awesome. And Dolphin, this was the one from 2003, I'm sorry. It's free and open source, but it didn't start out that way. And it's the emulator of GameCube. In fact, the Dolphin name refers to the code name of GameCube at Nintendo while this was being developed, while the hardware console was about to be released. Dolphin would later support Wii. Imagine there's a lot of commonalities in the Nintendo console life, kind of sticking to a standard when they develop these new systems. Dolphin was the first to boot a GameCube game, and also later on these Wii games as mentioned. What's cool, Dolphin being 100% open source, is entirely legal. I mean, there's no question about it. Dolphin is 100% legal, period. It's written from the ground up. They wrote their own custom HLE BIOS for this, okay? And so that means that they're taking that approach of adapting to individual games. And they've been working on this for so long, and I mean so long, that just recently, a couple years ago, they've been successfully able to boot 100% of the GameCube library using this software. And this is unheard of, because most emulators, there's always a couple games that are just a little weird, they glitch out, they don't work perfectly, but because emulators are trying to do something that is off limits or unknown to these developers. So they're doing their best to reverse engineer and figure out what's going on. And the Dolphin team did an exceptional job at figuring out how the GameCube worked and its gameplay. And this has continued to this day. This is still an ongoing developed project. You can go visit the Dolphin website. You can download it. You can review the source code. It's just really cool. But it, like a lot of these other systems, I mean, there's a lot of firsts happening. And this doesn't mean these are the only ones out there. I mean, there are hundreds of different emulation software suites for almost all the different game consoles. But a lot of them may only play a couple games. A lot of them may only do very basic, rudimentary things. But other ones have really been revolutionary and adding a ton of feature and really going above and beyond to support as many games as possible, as much peripheral as possible, and to provide the best experience for not just commercial games, but homebrew developers too, through debugging and memory modification and things like that. Okay. Now the boring stuff. Let's talk about legal. First off, I'm not an attorney and have no authority to give advice on legal matters. Thank you. Okay. So, I've kind of hinted at a lot of this stuff along the way, but emulators themselves were never really the legal part. They were never really a lot of the focus on these things. Unless they use some kind of proprietary code. Okay, those court cases against the Virtual Console and Bleem, it's not that they lost. Like, Sony didn't necessarily win. Sony just caused the company to collapse. So, again, if you're not stealing code from these companies and you're not, performing copyright infringement against these consoles, then an emulator is completely legal, as in it is unique and different, right? It may serve a similar purpose, but there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, and so it's always been the ROMs themselves, right? The copies of the games that companies fought against, because those were read-only memory. They were in an unmodified original form, and it is a perfect clone or a duplicate of these things. And that leads to a lot of arguments over, am I allowed to have copies and things like that? But let's just keep it straightforward. Downloading ROMs is illegal, sort of. And using copyrighted code is always illegal. And we all can easily agree on that, right? That's just the way it works. Because copyrights last for 75 years. And it hasn't been 75 years, right? These Nintendo stuff is from the maybe earliest the 80s, right? So we don't have that opportunity to cry copyright yet. Okay, so yes, copyright code is still illegal. All right, but how is there such a fledgling emulation and ROM scene? What the heck? If this is all technically criminal in some way, well, let's figure that out, right? There's a lot more to it. So the first argument that most people get into when we're talking about emulation is we call it fair use. All right. Fair use is kind of similar. It's the same way you can mock somebody by showing a video clip or picture of their thing and posting it online, right? Because you didn't steal the whole thing and you're reproducing. But I'm not a lawyer. Anyways, when it comes to gaming, fair use sounds like this, right? So if you already own an authentic cartridge, then if you want to play it on a different system, that should be okay, right? Yeah, mine, right? Well, was that game ever available on another system? Did you take away an opportunity of a sale? Okay, you have to ask yourself. Okay, if you keep it to yourself, right? Like if I dump my own ROMs with a ROM dumper, or I pull the ISOs off of my PlayStation 1 discs, and I own it, right? What's wrong with that? There's no additional loss of sale. I'm not giving it to anybody. It's mine. Well, how are you using it? And does the ownership and user license of that allow you to make backups or copies, right? Well, then fine. I won't download ROMs. I'll extract it using my tools, because it's no different than ripping the songs off of my CD into iTunes. I'm just digitalizing my media content. We've been doing that for years. There's nothing illegal about that, right? Well, so be it, I guess. Sounds about right. I don't think anything's really going to happen, but there may be an argument somewhere in there, right? It really comes down to sharing that data, right? It's like the rental concept. There's one cartridge, and when you went to Blockbuster, that one cartridge can only be used by one person at a time, right? But when you make a copy of it and it gets out of your possession, now there's two people using that same one cartridge. That genuinely is a loss of sale, okay? And so there's, again, this has never really been fully defined. There's a lot of gray area here and how a lot of this works. Well, let's think about how Nintendo feels about it. So Nintendo hates it. How does Nintendo feel about the emergence of video game emulators? They promote the play of illegal ROMs, not authentic games. Because where do you plug a cartridge into your laptop? I mean, you have an argument there. I'm not gonna. Okay. Can I download a Nintendo ROM from the internet if I already own an authentic game? What does Nintendo think of that? Well, the backup archival copy exemption, there's a very narrow limitation. It's complicated. But it's illegal to download and play a Nintendo ROM from the internet. Okay, I mean, look, somebody else has the ROM. They're sharing it with you. That's now the duplicate. We've already discussed why you shouldn't do that. But wait, Nintendo, I'm trying to make old games available that are no longer being sold. What do you have to say about that? Dude, it's still illegal. Like that's the response. And you can read more of this wonderful question and answer at nintendo.com/corp/legal. They really have an entire section dedicated to ROMs. And this is their take on the ROM community, the emulation community. There's a lot of great. This is only a couple key features in there. It's a long page. Fun read, just like the other fun things on the internet. So let's get into what's going on right now. Just a couple years ago, Nintendo did a huge ROMs online crackdown. And so during modern times, there were websites, just like any other website on the internet, that hosted content, just like any other website on the internet. But this content happened to be a bunch of game dumps, ROMs, that you can just simply click and download at free will. Well, Nintendo...
You started a poo-poo storm in the events channel over bringing up Nintendo.
Why?
Because people are very disgruntled.
They can be disgruntled. Tell them to go hear it. There's your URL, legal.jsp, and go read some of the things. Okay, so Nintendo finally picks a couple of victims. They're called Love Retro and Love ROMs. They happen to be the same web designer, web owner of these two sites. And they hosted these classic games, you know, stuff from Sega and Sony and Atari and others, right? They had ROMs, no way around it. What was interesting, but it was ran by a pair out of Arizona. And I think that was the first mistake, is they did it domestically. This was not something where they were out of reach, right, of the hands of Nintendo. And so this magic lawsuit appears at Love ROMs / Love Retro, targeted at these individuals in Arizona, because that's how you get people in trouble in the United States, is you throw them in court. And so just as this happening, some of the other emulation communities online go like, oh, like, I think there's about to be a big wash. So Emu Paradise, another large ROMs website, decided to take this opportunity to stay out of trouble and voluntarily, we'll call it, change directions. That's what they said. They wanted to change the direction of their site. And they removed all the ROMs to avoid getting in trouble, because they saw this was just a matter of time before other sites would start to be targeted next. Now, there's a weird coincidence of events taking place at this exact same time. Nintendo was launching its subscription service for the Switch to play retro titles. So we can't allow anybody to do what we're selling for free, especially if we're about to launch a whole service around it. Call me skeptical, but it sounds like this was timed. In the end, Love Retro and Love ROMs ended up settling for about $12 million. And if that doesn't scare you, this is serious. This is really, really serious. When I keep saying this is illegal. So be very careful, especially when it comes to the sharing of this game data, especially. Remember, we're still in a gray area when we keep it to ourselves. But like peer-to-peer, for instance, like once you're done with your copy, you're now sharing to other people. So that wasn't a one-way transaction. Right? Downloading from the internet may be a one-way transaction, but like peer-to-peer isn't, and that's where a lot of people now are still getting in trouble for this because of that sharing aspect that continues to happen. So just gotta think smart. All right.
Did you say settled for 12 million or sold for 12
Settled. Settled. Yeah, like settled out of court. $12 million is a lot of money, man.
They paid Nintendo $12 million.
They own Nintendo $12 million. I don't think they have $12 million. So, anyways, here's another fun event in current times. This literally just happened like a couple weeks ago. The Nintendo source code, a treasure trove of great things, was leaked. This is real. This is very real. Nintendo has validated. This is very real. The source code for the Nintendo 64, the GameCube, and the Wii console, along with a ton of other promotional information, game data, early betas, was all leaked. It was. You can find it online if you are really good at Googling. But the point is that this is very interesting. And the reason I wanted to highlight this as part of this talk is that this code now exists for the public. I mean, people don't see console source code, right, very often. So imagine if you're an emulator developer, you now have the keys to the kingdom. But it would be illegal to use the copyrighted source code. So it's a very dangerous area right now, and it's crazy. And we don't know what's going to happen if we start to see emulators released using proprietary code as part of this leak, right? And so I mentioned earlier the Dolphin emulator. They're very adamant about this. They said, and I quote, "haven't seen the leaks and don't want to." They don't even want to be questioned. So you looked at the code and then got an idea to write something. Like, they are staying as far away from this as possible because so far, like I said, 100% legal. They don't want to be looped into this. They don't want anything to get in trouble. So again, to not be accused of using proprietary code and that may end up in their open source project, right? And so they're very, very critical about this. Now, yes, technically Nintendo would still need to prove with evidence that the leaked code is appearing to have a strong case. But again, from what we've seen with the history of these large companies and their lawsuits, this is just not something you want to play with. And so there are still plenty of people having a great time with the source code. But if you are doing anything with it, you really, I don't suggest it. In fact, luckily, for the most part, we still stay in a position where just looking at it, though, isn't enough to justify cause that anything was actually used in a piece of software that maybe I'm developing as an emulator developer, right? So simply because we continue to reverse engineer, which is legal in the United States, right? We're allowed to rip apart a piece of software. So now that I've covered a lot of that fun stuff, let's talk about emulation today, right? Now that we're up to current modern times. And I chose these three pictures here as the new classic consoles. They just came out a couple years ago. They were wildly popular online. They're super cool because Nintendo and Sony decided to take the opportunity to bring back some of these retros. People clearly had a demand for them with the emulation scene. And so you can get one of these, and they're cool because if anybody remembers the size of a Nintendo and a Super Nintendo and a PlayStation, I mean, they had a little bit of bulk to them. They were about the size of about a takeout box, right? These ones, they're mini. They're tiny little things. They're adorable, and but they pack the same experience and punch. And so let's get into what these actually are. So the Nintendo Virtual Consoles, or not the Virtual Console. Let's talk about the Nintendo Virtual Console first. The Virtual Console is actually a piece of software. It was originally released for the Wii, but is also present on the 3DS and Wii U. This was Nintendo's take on bringing retro arcade to the modern system through a retail market. And so the Virtual Console software It uses emulation, and it allows you to purchase these old ROMs directly from Nintendo and play them on your modern Wii and 3DS consoles. What was interesting here is, by definition of emulation, again, these consoles, you can play a console on another console. And so the virtual console market allowed games from a variety of old retro systems. I mean, we're not just talking Nintendo stuff, so NES, Super NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, N64, Game Boy Advance. But they also had an emulator for Sega. They also had an emulator for TurboGrafx, Neo Geo, and even the Commodore 64. And so you now, through the proper legal channels, could play retro games on a Wii using Nintendo's Virtual Console software opportunity. This was great. I mean, this is really a big step where these big corporations are realizing they need to figure out how to take advantage of this market before it eats them up on a free scale, right, or a pirated scale. And the best way to target pirates is to make your stuff actually available and reasonable, right? And so this was a really cool approach, and so Nintendo started designing their own emulators. I mean, they had the source code to the old systems, but they actually started making their own emulators for their consoles, not stuff from the internet. So let's talk about these classics, right? And so they developed these emulators, and they're actually little Linux computers in these things. They run a Linux operating system. They run a custom emulator software designed by Nintendo for the sole purpose of playing an NES game or playing an SNES game. And it had a full screen front end, and the Nintendo Mini and Super Nintendo Mini came with games on the memory card already built in. And so it included a variety. In fact, the original NES contained 30 games built into it, and the SNES contained 21 games. And so you got a small, about the quarter of the size form factor of the original console, with HDMI out, running Linux, but silently. All you saw on the screen was just a menu. And it came with a bunch of games already built in. And this was great. It was super cool. It was wildly successful. I mean, they sold out so quickly. Fun fact, they are hackable because they are a computer. You can actually add additional games to the system. So if you have other ROM files, however you have them, you can add them and increase the stock or increase the capacity of these systems. So now your Super Nintendo with 21 stock built-in games can have 40, 50, and 60 games added to it, and it makes it a great, fun little portable gaming system. And same thing, 2-player support, came with the controls. I mean, it was just really interesting little device. In fact, you can often get them now on the secondhand market for very cheap. Now the spike in the interest is over. So, but kudos on you, Nintendo, for writing your own emulator to play on your own devices and approaching the retro demand. Okay, let's talk about how Microsoft approaches the emulation scene, right? What they do is they release a new console on a regular basis, and they want to have backwards compatibility. For a long time, these old console systems, the cartridge would only fit in that one system. You couldn't put a Super Nintendo, or you couldn't put an NES cartridge in a Super Nintendo. It was fixed console. There's no backwards compatibility. So Microsoft, when they released the Xbox 360, they targeted and they said, look, we want to offer backwards compatibility of all those great games you bought for the original Xbox. We don't want to leave you hanging. You want to play the original Halo, right? But you have a 360 now, because we want you to buy a 360 also. So they wrote an Xbox emulator to be used on the 360 to achieve that backwards compatibility. And that's super cool, all right? It's a very clever approach. And then this continued on. So the Xbox One had backwards compatibility to 360. And again, they're staying true to this concept of we don't want to leave you hanging. So they put in a lot of effort to make sure that you could play older Xbox games on modern systems through an emulator, because the hardware and the architecture, changed over the years. So you couldn't just rely on, continued hardware support. You had to emulate it somehow. In fact, the modern Xbox hardware is x86 based versus some of the older ones, which were a little bit different. So nowadays, we can pretty much emulate anything on a modern Xbox, any of the old systems. And it's great for offering that compatibility. So Sony, what do they do? Very similar to Xbox. Their PlayStation 3, they wanted to offer backwards compatibility also. Again, competing market, plus why not? You gotta have loyal fans. And so they also use emulation software on modern systems to play classic games. Now, there was reading about how, I think it was the PS2, had particular chips from the PlayStation 1 to be able to support it. So it was kind of like a hardware adaptation. But PS3 is genuinely an emulator through and through by Sony to be able to support some of these classic games. And so that's the fixed one. Now, let's talk about the PlayStation Classic. Their similar approach to the way that Nintendo did for the two minis, right? The NES and Super NES. Well, what this does, instead of a from the ground up written by them, like how Nintendo wrote their own emulator, the PlayStation Classic, this retro console, it uses something called PCSX, which was an emulator from the early days. In fact, the original PCSX discontinued in 2003. And then the next variation the team took over called it PSX Reloaded, right? This is the next iteration. And then this particular version found on the PlayStation Classic is called Rearmed. Well, ARMed meaning ARM architecture, what the chip inside this small Linux computer is running on. And this made huge waves on the scene. People were super upset. How could you, Sony, release a piece of hardware for sale using somebody else's open source code project, and you spend years going after the emulation scene and fighting everybody with litigation? And they said, we don't care. It's open source under GPL, and we're allowed to do this. So deal with it, bro. And and so they are using the basis of a community emulation software in their piece of hardware sold today. Luckily, similar to the Nintendos, these are hackable, little Linux computer. You can add additional PlayStation ROM or ISOs to this system and play off of, add additional ones and play other games than the stock 20 that came with it. And actually, fun fact is that it varied by country. So the top 20 games for America was actually different than the top 20 games for Japan. And so you missed out if there was a variety of games that maybe you wanted but weren't able to get. So again, the benefits of emulation definitely are out there. Okay, so I've been talking for an hour now about history and politics and theory. Let's actually talk about building your own emulation station. So this particular picture I'm using here is a case for a Raspberry Pi meant to resemble the original NES. Because that's what we're doing, man. We're turning this Pi into a gaming system, so why not add a little flair to it, right? So what exactly is going on here? Let's talk about the stack, right? And there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to having your own emulation system. We'll start at the top, which is the Raspbian operating system, which is Debian-based. And so think Raspberry Pi, Debian mixed together. And we have the Raspbian OS, which actually, upon the release of the new Raspberry Pi 4 8 gig, which just came out, I think they're changing the name to Raspberry Pi OS. But anyways, following that, we have RetroPie. RetroPie is the key focus here. It's what we're here for today. It's one of the more popular approaches to having a system dedicated to gaming and retro and fun stuff like that. And so this multi-system software framework, it it provides all of the things, right? So it's got the facilities for the emulators to launch and control them, along configuration of these features and screen resolutions and controller setup. So RetroPie is the suite that has a lot of other things within it to make it successful. So Emulation Station is going to be the graphical front end that you see when you're interacting with the device. Remember, a lot of this is abstracted software behind the scenes. So Emulation Station is your GUI, your user interface, right? So this front end allows you to selection of video game systems and emulators and games and stuff like that to play. And then finally, the star of it all is RetroArch. And so RetroArch is the actual framework that has cores built around it. So you would have a core for Super Nintendo, and a core for NES, and a core for Game Boy, and a core for PlayStation. And it is the main emulation software taking place here, right? And the cores are written as part of this thing called libretro API. And so we have a main piece of software that handles game emulation, and then each individual libretro core is specific to each console about how to process that data, right? What makes it specific and different. And really, at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff isn't as necessary if you're just trying to have fun. But it is good to know some of the moving parts in these systems. And I'm only going to scratch the surface on a lot of this because there's so much. I really highly suggest checking out the RetroPie website. But at least we understand we have our Linux OS, our software suite, our GUI front end, and our secret sauce. So, all right, let's make a couple more definitions. RetroArch is the software front end of the libretro API that makes up a large portion of the emulators included in RetroPie. Again, we put RetroArch at the bottom because it's the actual emulation software and APIing with all of these independent systems, right, and configurations, all the game consoles. So RetroArch and libretro provide a way to take an existing emulator and load that as a library or core. So if you're familiar with programming, like each console is considered like a library. So if you want to play NES, we have the base RetroArch system, and then the NES library is brought in to successfully play that. So again, there's all kinds of interesting caveats. But RetroArch is what ultimately handles taking that controller, or whatever your input is, and giving it to that emulator core so that it can emulate, the button presses for you. It does that through this thing called RetroPad. So to keep things simple, RetroPie has put a lot into the suite to automate these things behind the scenes so that you don't have to deal with this. Originally, if you had an emulator for NES, you'd have to configure it. And then if you had an emulator for SNES, you'd have to configure that separately. The ability of combining a lot of these suites together allows you to kind of do one configuration globally. And so what happens here with RetroPad is you configure your controller initially in Emulation Station, our GUI, and it automatically configures all of the different virtual consoles that you have, these emulators. And it maps those real world. So if you think, so you only have one controller, but if you want to use 5 different systems, the button, like the pads are different on every console, right? And so this allows us to use one controller and map it virtually to all these other systems. Again, there's a lot of technicalities going on behind the scenes here, but know that there's stacks of software suites making this as simple and as easy as possible for the average user to get up and play. The reason I picked this particular layout is because RetroPad uses a basic ABXY layout similar to a Super Nintendo, PlayStation 6-axis controller, and an Xbox. They all have a 4-button right side standard. And so I personally use a PlayStation 6-axis controller because it has the best wide availability and support for all of the different emulator consoles to be able to have all of the buttons mapped in place. Even the funny looking Nintendo 64 is able to effectively map to a PlayStation controller to still be able to push all the buttons. So, technology. Let's talk about the recipe for success. We're going to cook us up a little pie. What do you need? You need 1 Raspberry Pi. Boom. Okay. Camera's off. Okay. You need 1 legit power supply. And I heavily want to focus on the fact that this is a legitimate power supply because the power requirements of a Raspberry Pi are generally higher than your average cell phone charger. Your average cell phone charger maybe is about 1 amp at 5 volts. A Raspberry Pi needs about 2.5 amps at 5 volts. So do not skimp out. Use an official one or use a properly rated power supply, or else you get a cute little lightning bolt in the top right that says that you're undervolting and you're undersupplying the whole time, and it's really obnoxious. It also, you want the Pi to run at its full speed. So again, good power supply. Super cool case. I showed you the one about the NES. You can use really any case. You do want to consider cooling when it comes to this stuff, so preferably a case with a fan, because you're going to be running that system and that processor pretty tough. You're going to need, obviously, an SD card. The only caveat to that is that Raspberry Pi Foundation just released a beta firmware that allows you to now boot from USB instead of booting from SD, which is great because you can get a very cheap USB SSD and do everything off of that. And it's just blazing fast. So it's a very new thing. It just came out, still very beta. I'm still running an SD card, but you can research that on your own if you want to figure out how to boot off of a USB thumb drive or external hard drive of some sort to optimize your experience. And then finally, you need controllers. So what I use, as I mentioned, is I actually use original PlayStation 1 controllers. But what's cool is I have an adapter that converts the original PlayStation controller to USB. And that allows me to use 2 great original Sony PlayStation controllers from the PS1, 6-axis controllers. And the adapter that converts them to USB treats them like a joystick. So its compatibility is already there. And it's very simple and easy to use. And I mentioned earlier, the PlayStation controller, in my opinion, is the most compatible with the variety of console gamepads that exist. In my opinion, at least, it is my favorite. And I haven't had any issues with it. It just has all the buttons that you need to map to any existing system. So, first steps first, you always got to prepare that SD card, so you go and download the RetroPie pre-made image. So you don't have to do anything crazy here. We're not Gen 2 and compiling from source. A lot of stuff is already done. It wasn't until more recently that they started officially supporting the Raspberry Pi 4. Everything up to now actually has been the 3 and prior. But now they have an official Raspberry Pi 4 image. So if you're using a 4B, go get the 4 image. You download it, you use some kind of SD card tool. My favorite one is Etcher. It's easy, it's free to use, and it works really well. And so once you get that on the card, go ahead and toss that in your Raspberry Pi console, and let's turn it on. Oh, just kidding. We're not going to boot up yet. I always have my special slides. So one thing, this is kind of like a gotcha for most new players. Take a minute and configure some files on the SD card before you put it in your Pi, one of them being the WPA supplicant. This is how you pre-configure wireless on it so that you don't have to scramble to your router and figure out what IP address was issued to the Pi. This way, it'll automatically connect to your Wi-Fi. You don't got to deal with Ethernet. You don't got to deal with all this other stuff. You don't got to configure the device, by hand. And it actually publishes a DNS name, so retropie.local. So you can automatically go to that in your network also. It just makes things a lot easier to start. The other one I also suggest, especially because I'm a big fan of Linux, is creating an SSH file. What this does is you create a blank SSH file, again, on that boot partition on the SD card, readable by Windows, easy to do. You just create this blank file, and what it does is it turns on the SSH daemon, the service, so that after it, now that you've given it Wi-Fi credentials and it is able to connect to the network, you're able to also SSH into it right away and traverse the operating system and perform other operations. So these are just my suggestions on your first boot, so that you can just kind of skip a couple steps and make things easier and just to get to work. So let's plug in and power on. All right, so I talked about controllers. And so what I brought with me today is that adapter I mentioned. And so if you see here, these PlayStation controllers connect to a blue USB adapter that connects directly into the Raspberry Pi. And so you have player 1 and player 2. And so that's the same adapter I've been using for a very long time. And I mean really long time. And so I have that pictured here on the slide. And they're dirt cheap on Amazon, and it's been a huge success. I also like hardwired for the same reason some other people like having hardwired peripherals. No delay, no interference. The other way, perfectly acceptable, is a Bluetooth controller. So maybe like a PlayStation 3 or PlayStation 4 generation Bluetooth 6-axis DualShock. There's wonderful third-party markets around this. So 8BitDo. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. But anyways, they actually make a lot of really cool controllers. So you can see here, this is a Nintendo style mixed with a PlayStation style, because it has double rockers and it has the two, analog sticks. And again, this kind of goes back to that thing. I'm very biased that the PlayStation controller layout is the most optimal for emulation. But this manufacturer makes a ton of controllers in all different shapes and sizes, and most of them are Bluetooth, but they also offer wired USB ones. And they're actually supported by a variety of other consoles, not just for our purposes here in emulation, but they actually are supported by stuff like a Switch as a external controller than the Joy-Cons that come with it. So you got to get yourself some controllers to start. All right, if you've got an old system around, I'm telling you, nothing beats having the adapter and running wired and just it's working. But these Bluetooth ones work just as great, especially because the modern Raspberry Pis have Bluetooth built in. You can also just get a USB Bluetooth adapter if you want. But again, your mileage may vary. Oftentimes you'll find that you need to get very close to it for a lot of 2.4 gig interference, especially if you have a lot of wireless and Bluetooth devices in your house or your vicinity. So once we boot up for that first time and we got our controllers, we'll need to map them. And so we'll press and hold that A or X button, right? If you're using an Xbox or PlayStation, whatever you've decided. And it'll ask you, press the up button, press the down button, press the left button, right button, press the, the X, the A, the B, the Y, the start, select, the R1, R2, L1, L2. You go through and you show it where all of your different buttons exist and what they map to, so that they can then relate to those other console systems. And again, the up arrow is when it selects the input, it needs to apply it to, again, all of those different consoles, right? To those virtual controllers, that retro pad. Something interesting here is when you're setting up the controller, you're going to do what's called a hotkey. This is the last button at the bottom of the list. And this hotkey is kind of like a secret hidden button. The purpose of this is to launch the RetroArch configuration menu mid-game. Now, why would you want to launch a menu mid-game? Well, if that menu is used to maybe save the state of it, like capture all the memory at that time, you could also use that menu to adjust graphics, to adjust sound, to maybe eject the disc if you're playing an old PlayStation game that uses multiple discs, and the game says, please insert disc 2. What you can do is within that RetroArch special menu, you can virtually eject the disk and then load up a different ISO without having to leave the game, right? And so this RetroArch menu has a ton of settings and a ton of features, a lot of it around graphics and sound and other ways of making the game successfully playable and visually appealing. But you definitely want to make sure you have a hotkey match, because that's also the hotkey of how you get out of the game and go back to the main menu. So, some Bluetooth controllers may require some extra steps. I highly suggest you check out the RetroPie documentation on their website for that specific controller about what steps are required to get them working so that you can map them. For instance, 6-axis PlayStation controllers, there's a library. You just have to install it. They have all the steps on the website. In fact, they have almost every controller on the market and how to set them up if it's not a hardwired one. The hardwired ones just work right out of the box. So it's just the Bluetooth stuff takes a bit to get working initially at first. The other cool thing you want to do is you want to set up a sweet theme, right? Because what's your console without themes? And so this kind of brings us into the idea of, all right, now I have the system, I need to maybe start customizing things, right? And so there's a theme library available on the RetroPie website. And so you can look through all the themes and decide which one looks the best. My favorite is called Tronifran. I don't know why it's called that, but I think it looks the most appealing. In fact, if I use my hotkey button and bring it back to the menu, that's what Tronifran kind of looks like. It has this big picture in the background, and it looks super cool. The other thing, too, is this is going to start introducing us to the RetroPie setup script, where most of your experiential configurations are going to take place. This is where you turn on and turn off Bluetooth. This is where you add Bluetooth controllers. This is where you maybe change the output of your audio from the HDMI port to the headphone jack if you're plugging it into an amplifier, for instance. And so a lot of the operating system configurations, or the emulation station configurations and experiential configurations are going to be in this RetroPie setup script, which is in the RetroPie menu. So I'll just kind of pop into that real quickly. We can go over here to RetroPie. I'll do that again for the camera. I know, I'm making it work. So the RetroPie is one of the systems on here, and so we can load into this, and we'll see here stuff like audio, Bluetooth configurations. Here's your themes that you want to update and modify. There's the Raspy config, which if you're familiar with using Raspbian, that's one of the scripts that how you configure the operating system. But the big one you'll use most often is going to be the RetroPie setup. And that's going to give you a lot of configurations about, again, playing and your experience with the environment. So now that we're in there, again, I mentioned, we're talking Bluetooth. Here's something interesting. Not all emulators are included. We'll get into what that means, but there's a functionality out of the box, but then there's additional steps to do additional things, and I'll explain what that means. But again, RetroPie setup script, you want to navigate through it, check it out, read the information online and figure out what's capable of it. Again, we talked about that RetroArch configuration that you bring up with that secret menu. Some other things you can do with the RetroArch menu, if you're in there, is you can do something called NetPlay. And NetPlay is awesome. This isn't a new concept. It's been around since some of the older emulators. But the idea of NetPlay is virtualizing Player 2 across the web. And so...
now suddenly it makes sense to me why.
Yeah, exactly. So NetPlay is super cool. So a server-client kind of idea. Both players need to have the same ROM file, and you can configure RetroArch to have somebody connect to you or you connect to them, and they will act as player 2, and you can play player 1 and player 2 either in a local network or across the internet, which is super cool to have the ability to do multiplayer with this. I mean, it's just awesome. The other one too is cheats. You can actually apply game cheats. So memory modifications, infinite life, ammo, things like that. Because RetroArch is the base emulator system, it controls all the memory and the moving functions. And so you can apply different cheats in this too. So again, exploring these menus, exploring these options. again, out of the box, this will already do a ton of stuff. You probably will never need to go into any of these menus or systems to successfully have a good time, and it'll just work. But if you really want to, learn more about it and dig in, I suggest, looking at what is available. So let's talk about sourcing emulators and games. This has been a delicate topic, and I'm not going to just go blow it in one go. So let's figure this out. One more time, because we like to do this. Due to the nature and complexity of copyright intellectual property right laws, which differ significantly from country to country, wherever you may be watching this YouTube stream from, ROMs cannot be provided with RetroPie and must be provided by the user. You should only have ROMs of games that you own. Period. Okay. Thank you. No, really. I can't help you. Just Google. Really, I do not want to get into that one.
Do you have Battletoads?
Do I have Battletoads? Of course. I call GameStop every week asking for that. So, talk to me in Russian, and we can talk about how to get games. Really, Google's your friend in this. Nintendo ROMs, second link? I don't know. You Google it.
Can you find actual physical ROMs like on eBay? Are there people selling?
So you can buy. No, that's acceptable. So you can buy cartridges, but you cannot buy ROMs.
Fully legally, right?
You can.
I'm sorry, not buy ROMs. But I could go out and buy cartridges. Right?
Correct. The resale of a cartridge is entirely legal.
Even if the game doesn't work, the cartridge, as long as you own the cartridge, like say you get an old school.
If it's an authentic one,
Yes.
I'm not an attorney, but as far as my understanding is yes.
Right.
So okay.
And they're theoretically available out there that you could get.
Correct. Everything in theory. So now that you have your ROMs, however you acquired them, not my problem. I don't want to know about it either. Don't ask me. I'm not going to endorse that. You want to transfer your ROMs to the Raspberry Pi because this is, this isolated computer system. So there are three main methods. The first method is to copy them to the SD card. And I'm not talking like take the SD card out and plug it into your computer. I'm talking you use a thumb drive. It's a little bit of a process, and I'll go over it on the next slide. But the idea is using a thumb drive, the Raspberry Pi will pull the data off the thumb drive and store it locally on the SD card so that you just have them on the Pi all the time, and you don't need to plug a thumb drive in. The other easy methods, in my opinion, is stuff like SFTP and SCP, if you're familiar with SSH protocol to send those things, or using Windows Samba shares. In fact, you can find your RetroPie on your network in Windows, and it already has shares that are writable for you to add games to. So let's just kind of quickly jump into what that USB method is. We were experimenting with it a little bit earlier, and it's very specific. But you start out with it in your computer, you create this folder called RetroPie, a blank folder, and then you plug it into the Pi, and what the Pi does is it initializes that folder and adds like a bunch of content to it. After that, you put it back in your computer, and there's going to be magically a ROMs folder. And in this ROMs folder is where you place your respective games, and there'll be a series of folders. It'll say PSX, NES, SNES, Game Boy. Like, it'll have them all listed there. That's what the initialization process is. So you just put the ROM files in those respective folders, and that's how it keeps track of organization. And then we finally plug it back into the Pi. And then using the menu, we just press start, and we do restart emulation station, and it reloads the GUI. And in this process, it also re-indexes all of the stored games. The Raspberry Pi will then copy the games off of the SD card off of the USB onto the SD card, and they will be stored locally on that system from that point on. So then you can disconnect the USB, and that's the transfer method to make the games go with you, so that you don't need to keep a thumb drive plugged in. Again, my personal favorite, I just pull up SCP with a terminal, and I shift the files right over, or you use your favorite, SFTP client or WinSCP or whatever. You log in with the default creds to SSH using Pi and Raspberry. Remember, we turned on SSH earlier. This gives us the ability to quickly transfer files over the network without a thumb drive. If you're on Windows and you don't feel like using WinSCP or PuTTY, you can also use Samba. So again, just go into your network shares and it should pop right up because it's pre-configured to share a Windows share also. So they're trying to make this as simple and as easy as possible. Again, once the games are sent over to the ROMs folder, very easy to organize things. Restart the emulation station, reindexes the games, and you're good to go. And that is how you make the emulators appear. Initial boot won't have any emulators listed. The emulators only appear if there's a game for it. Then it will only show the ones that you have games for. So it's not gonna, you're not going to have, Commodore 64 and Amiga and Neo Geo if you don't have games. So they're not going to appear on the menu. Just in case you get worried or confused, like, I set this whole thing up. Where's all the emulators? How do I launch my games? And it's like, well, you need the games first. And again, they only appear if a ROM exists for that system. So it kind of got worried the first time I did it too, and I was like, I think something's broken. How does this thing work? But I read what it said on the website. So
Have you ever seen someone do like a mega pack that, whether they should or not legally, it's like the entire universe of... Is it
Google. I heard from somebody on the internet
somebody might have done that, like a
that
archive that you...
bundles of console games exist. Like all of them.
That we just push to the Wayback Machine and...
The Wayback Machine's your best friend. Yeah, it's a great place. So, I mentioned this earlier that some systems also require a BIOS. I'm not going to tell you how or where to get those BIOSes, but the documentation is very clear on the BIOS that you need. For instance, it'll give you the hash of a BIOS file, and it's up to you to figure out where to originate that. PlayStation, for instance, requires a BIOS. Dreamcast requires a BIOS. Genesis, Game Boy, so they do require it. And this is, again, a prerequisite before you're really jumping in and playing these games on the emulator. So there's a very kind BIOS directory on your RetroPie. You'll find it very quickly. So ROMs go in ROMs, BIOSes go in BIOSes. You'll know you have the right BIOS when the MD5 hash matches the one in the documentation. There are like third-party BIOSes and ones that are not pirated from these consoles. So the more you learn, the more you know. You'll see what I'm talking about when you kind of get into it. Again,
and theoretically, those third-party BIOSes aren't copyright restricted.
Correct. They function similarly in an emulation manner. All right, so I just want to remind this, similar to finding ROMs, these BIOSes are copyrighted and illegal to download. You're on your own with this too. Google's your friend. Okay. So let's talk about displaying the emulator console. So I mentioned when ROMs are added, they'll start to appear. And here's the thing I mentioned earlier also, is that not all consoles appear either. So, right? So Dreamcast is a great example of one of them, where you may have a Dreamcast game, but it still doesn't show up on your home screen. Where's the Dreamcast, right? And this requires some additional installation steps. Not difficult or anything. You're just going to have to go back into the RetroPie setup script that we talked so highly about earlier that has all the other configurations. And you can add the Dreamcast emulator. It just so happens to not be bundled by default. It's an add-on. You get it as an option. And this kind of brings us to, well, then what's the deal with all the emulators? And there's emulators that are built on RetroArch, so they're libretro API cores. And then there's independent emulators. For instance, like the Dreamcast called DryCast. It is entirely independent, separate of RetroArch. May require its own separate configuration. Remember that beauty of RetroArch is that it's one software, all consoles that are supported by it. So you configure it once. And so you can determine which emulators in your software suite are part of libretro because they're denoted by an LR. It's actually in the name of it. So for instance, LR SNES 9X is the libretro core versus the standalone, right? So it means it's automatically going to work and be configured when you set up your initial controller versus having to go through your own independent setup process. So you'll see a lot of different emulators that are available to be added to the RetroPie setup. Most of them are going to be libretro, right? So they're going to be natively compatible, all part of the same ecosystem, but you will also find ones that are independent and standalone. And they, there may be benefits to running an independent emulator if it's targeted or specialized. You also may find that some systems just never really got into libretro and RetroArch, and they just kind of they continued on their own method and never really joined that API, that core system. So each system may vary. You will find it out as you add games. So let's get into the fun stuff, tips and tricks. And so, man, I loved my Game Genie. Has anybody had a Game Genie? It was so cool. And I never understood what I was doing until I was much older, because the Game Genie, the Game Shark 2, right? The Game Genie is modifying memory. Like when you're typing in those codes, they were hexadecimal, right? Those were addresses. That was like replacing memory with information. It was very cool. And I never understood why. I'd read the big book and typed like F37B. That didn't make sense to me at the time, but now understanding what hexadecimal is makes perfect sense with memory addresses. So let's talk about it. My first #1 resource to really getting to know what this is about is YouTube. I YouTube everything. I watched a ton of YouTube. It helped me put together a lot of the research for this presentation. And so I put up a couple of my favorite channels. My #1 favorite channel is Modern Vintage Gamer. This guy actually is so into the emulation scene that he was the author of a ton of emulators back in the day and involved in emulators from Xbox. Even the modern Nintendo Switch, he's involved in writing emulators for, so that you can play other consoles on a Switch. He's been around the scene for a long time. He's very knowledgeable and very entertaining to watch. ETA Prime is another big one that I love. And we were talking about ETA Prime in the Slack the other day. In fact, the E in ETA Prime, typo, is emulation. So, and so he talks about all kinds of different hardware and single board computers and handheld emulators, because that's also a big thing now, is independent handheld emulators coming out of the Chinese market that are, think Raspberry Pi plus screen plus controller all in one plastic shell, and with an SD card slot that you load all the games into. And so it is a Nintendo Switch for the purpose of playing emulators and so that's really big right now. And so ETA Prime's a great channel and just gets into a lot of details about what's going on in the emulation scene and what's out there, what's available from the hardware side, and how to get into it. Too Late Nate is something I more recently got into, but he did an awesome history series on the history of early NES, Game Boy, PlayStation emulation, and the different groups and experiences over time with that. And he just has a lot of content and information about game emulation, and it's just really fun to watch. And then Gaming Historian is just a general treasure trove of information about what we're doing today, which is we're playing a game from the late 80s on a computer the size of a deck of cards, right? In 2020. So it's a really cool YouTube channel and just really solid info about the history of games and modern games, and just plethora of information if you just ever want to understand really what's going on and not just be glued to a TV with a control stick in your hand. So great YouTube channels. Do check them out. Big fan of all their material. So here's one for you. Instead of playing all the games off of the SD card, and historically, being Pi month, let's just talk about Pis and SD cards. SD cards only have so many write cycles before they start to kind of shit themselves. And there's nothing worse than your Raspberry Pi's card being corrupted because you used it too much. It's a very common issue. The other big one I'm calling out here is what's the capacity of a CD? 700 megabytes? Okay, how many ISOs can you really fit on a 16 or 32 gig card? You're not going to fit your whole PlayStation 2 library. So the reality is that you're going to want to find a way to store larger media and more reliably too, so that you're not crashing your cards and having to start all over. I mean, it's really obnoxious when your SD card in your Raspberry Pi dies. I just hate it when it happens. So you can use, you lose everything. And so you can use stuff like an external hard drive to store all of your games, which is a great option. This bypasses that ability to just copy it locally. It just uses an external media full time. Or what I do at home is I actually use my QNAP. I have a NAS at home, and I have an FS mount. And my Raspberry Pi reads all of my game data off of my NAS, which has spinning platters in RAID. You know, I'm not losing that save file. I'm pretty far along in my Pokemon experience, okay? So there's a couple different, methods that you can start to think about if you're really starting to get into playing this on a regular basis. So consider the large storage and the rewrite exceptions when it comes to SD cards. You want to disable that ROM service, which is in that in the Raspberry Pi setup script. If you want to use a USB external drive, I mean, a 1 terabyte external USB these days is like $60. They're nothing.
Even less.
Didn't I just read something that the Pi support Pixie Boot?
Firmware change.
It probably does now too.
mean,
I
so
like
you can
Pixie.
do like a crazy thing where you don't put anything in the Pi, it Pixie Boots. And then
The whole thing, yeah. So there's a lot of advantages of moving away from the internal SD card. For the meantime, it's great. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you want to have a well-maintained system and use it consistently, I would suggest seeking a way to store your game data and your save data elsewhere. Both of you, the ultimate idea is that you're mounting that RetroPie data set somewhere else, whether that's across the network or on a mounted partition externally on a device. So fun stuff, keep in mind. There's great information about this on the website. Handling of saved games. So this is the one that caught me early on. I was trying to figure out how to deal with this. So check this out. The RetroArch standard is for a saved game to be stored in what's called an SRM extension. And so if you're like a Super Nintendo, the way you save games on a cartridge is there's actually a memory chip and a battery inside that cartridge. And those batteries are supposed to last like a decade, okay? And so if you've ever tried to play a classic game, you may realize that there's no more saved files on it because the battery actually died. And the RAM, okay, that random access memory, it disappeared as soon as it loses power. So old cartridges do genuinely have batteries in them. Game Boy cartridges have batteries in them. Nintendo cartridges have batteries in them. They do, little batteries. Little lithium batteries. And again, they're so low voltage to operate. They're supposed to last like 10, 12 years. And but anyway, so RetroArch handles storage, whether it's a game cartridge memory chip or like a PlayStation memory card or a Dreamcast memory card or all the different ways that we stored games and throughout time. And here's an interesting challenge. The file is the exact same name of the file for the game ROM. Now, some games can share memory. So for instance, in my example here, the memory of Pokemon Blue can also be read by Pokemon Red. So if you want to have one profile but play the two different games with it, how do you share the memory between the two, the save game? And so what you use is something called a symlink. This is a Linux term that essentially it's similar to what you see in Windows with the little arrow on the icon on your desktop. The point is that the file it's not really a file, it's just a reference to another file, but it can have a different name. And so this allows us to have Pokemon Blue.srm and Pokemon Red.srm, where one actually is just pointing to the other. This is very common also in multi-game PlayStation games. So for instance, when you're playing Final Fantasy VII, and it asks you to transition to disc 2, one, you got to retro arch and you got to virtually eject and reload the next game. But let's say you save and you quit out. The file name is disk1.srm, and now you have disk 2, and it can't find that saved game. So you will create a symlink for each additional disk referencing back to disk 1. That way, whether you're on disk 2, disk 3, or if you're playing Final Fantasy IX, disk 4, you can still use the same one save file. And this is just kind of a little specific that has to do with the way the naming convention goes for your save games. This is also just good to know in general, where if you want to maybe format and reinstall RetroPie and try some different directions, save your SRMs. These are the save files that you've worked so hard on. So this is also just some, and it's in the same folder where your ROM file is. So there'll be the ROM file, and then it'll be the SRM file accompanying with it with the same name. So go ahead and back those up too, because it's tough starting all over, especially if put a lot of time into these things. So again, really good tips and trips for new players. The other big feature I love is called the Game Scraper. And what this does is it adds really rich media to your emulation station experience. And what I mean by this is when you first boot up emulation station and you finally get your game ROMs in and you finally have the emulators appearing and you can navigate through them and pick what game you want to play, there isn't much other than the file name. And so the scraper adds meta and it adds details. So I'll pop in over here to this NES system, and when we enter it, we have a significant amount of context added to the screen. We have the cartridge cover, we have information about its publisher and release, how many players it has, and even in a brief synopsis. So this information is downloaded automatically as part of the scraper service. And this is built into Emulation Station. And it just makes, it just looks a lot better. It fixes the name and the title of the game, but it also, again, adds all the art, all the details. It just creates a cleaner experience. Again, you don't have to do this. In fact, you don't have to do a lot of the things. It'll just keep working. But this is just, it's just an extra little experience that I like to add, right? And the way it does this is it reads the file name and it uses a game database online, which is a website. It's a public service, and they archive all this great information. And so it queries, hey, Donkey Kong, NES.
Like album art stuff.
It is. It's just like CDDB for album art or for movies. Same concept that Plex uses when you inventory all your stuff, and it does all the art instead of the very basic plain view. So just so you know, now this exists for games also, which is great. So not just TV, not just for music and movies, but also games. It just makes it so much prettier, so much nicer. So in the end, there's a ton of configurations, and you can spend a while kind of navigating through it, reading the documentation, seeing what's out there. Read the docs on the RetroPie website. They're stupid easy, step by step, really, really, really solid. It's how I learned how to do all this stuff. When I made a mistake, I went to the RetroPie website and found the answer of what I'm looking for. Why didn't Dreamcast show up? Because it's not pre-installed. You have to click this button in the menu to install it. Again, they're going to find a lot of gotchas. I've shared a couple of my quick experiences to kind of get you to speed faster. Your mileage may vary, and so check it out. Also, just look on YouTube. A ton of information already available online. I've mentioned some great YouTube channels about where to get history and information about emulation, and about what's going on with RetroPie and how to do stuff. The other big thing too is have fun. Don't take this too seriously. If you break, RetroPie, just reflash the card. If your card crashes, reflash the card, get a new one. The whole point of this is we're having fun. We're playing games, right? And really just enjoy the experience. So with that, I will go ahead and open this up to some Mario questions.